On your left.
And I do mean squares at this point, because this is something I have been wanting to do for quite a long time, and I couldn't find the right material to actually express it. You're trying to find it in books and stuff like that. You can find it, but it can kind of go left, right? But I wanted to talk about what I've known for a long time is that this battle between socialists and so-called conservatives and so-called liberals and progressives and all that kind of stuff is really just a farce. It's really just a position that people want to take opposite to each other because it sounds good. A conservative and against a liberal doesn't mean very much because they're both liberal. And I keep getting pushback from that because most people that are conservative don't really know what it means to be conservative. I always tell people that are conservatives, they're classic liberals. But the thing is, they don't know what a classic liberal is. And since they don't know what a classic liberal is, they go back to their default. But I found this video because I like John Mersheimer, because just like him, I've discovered that I am also a realist, a structural realist, just like he is. And the reason how I found that out is because I was listening to him give a speech on the Ukraine, and what he was saying, I could have wrote, because it was like he was in my head, and he was saying the exact same things were actually in my head. So that's when I discovered that, okay, this is the philosophy that you've been following for the last 30 years, just not knowing it. But he gave a talk about liberalism, because he wrote a book in 2018 about the Great Delusion. And it was so spot on, I just want to share it. This is the first one. We're going to react to this one. And there's another one that I'm going to do at another time that kind of breaks it down even further between the classes of liberalism in the United States. Okay. And, the Green Gorilla would love this one because he said essentially the same thing. But without further ado, instead of wasting time, I'm actually going to bring him up on video.
And liberalism. And I believe, again, that we have followed.
And we're going to start it because he's actually going to, he's actually talking about liberal hegemony, about spreading liberal democracies throughout the world to actually make it one unipolar place. But that's probably a little bit beyond the scope of this talk. But we're going to start here. He's actually going to go through exactly what a liberal is versus a nationalist is, or collectivist is. And it gets kind of deep because it's deep, but it's also very simple, the way he puts it. So without further ado, John Mearsheimer, excuse me.
Followed what is essentially a liberal foreign policy. This is called liberal hegemony, and that it has been defeated at almost every turn by nationalism and realism. Okay? Now, the way I want to proceed is, first of all, I want to talk about what liberalism is. Then I want to talk about what nationalism is. And when I talk about liberalism and nationalism, I'm not going to say anything about international politics, at least in any meaningful way. I just want to give you a sense for what liberalism is. The United States is a thoroughly liberal country. It is a liberal democracy. Both Republicans, who we sometimes refer to as conservatives, are liberals, and Democrats are liberals. I'm using the term liberal in the John Lockean sense of the term.
Yes.
The United States was born as a liberal democracy. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, these are thoroughly liberal documents. We are a liberal people, okay? But what exactly does that mean? It's very important that you understand it, because you have to understand what liberalism is to understand liberal hegemony and what went wrong. Then it's very important to understand what nationalism is. John's argument is very simple here. Nationalism is the most powerful ideology on the planet. And in a contest between liberalism and nationalism, nationalism wins every time.
Yep.
And what I want to do is explain to you what liberalism is, what nationalism is, and why nationalism defeats liberalism. Then what I want to do is talk about what liberal hegemony is. What does it mean to say that the United States is interested in remaking the world in its own image? So I'll describe that. Then I want to talk about why we pursued liberal hegemony. And of course, I've tipped you off by telling you that the United States is a thoroughly liberal country, but there's more to the story. Then I want to tell you what our track record is. I want to describe our failures in the Middle East, with regard to NATO expansion in Russia, and with regard to engagement in China. Just talk about the evidence that we goofed. Then I want to talk about why liberal hegemony fails. And this, again, is basically a story about nationalism and realism trumping liberalism. And then I want to make the case for restraint, what I think is a wise foreign policy. Okay? So let me start with what is liberalism. There are two bedrock assumptions that underpin liberalism. One is that it's individualistic at its core. And number two is that there are real limits to what we can do with our critical faculties to reach agreement on first principles or questions about the good life. Now, what exactly am I saying? You have to decide when you think about politics whether you think human beings are first and foremost individuals who form social contracts, or you think that human beings are fundamentally social animals who carve out room for their individualism.
Very, very distinctive ideas, even though they're opposite. They sound similar, but they're very distinctive.
Okay? This is very, very important to think about. Right? Liberalism is all about individualism. Liberal theorists are known as social contract theorists.
Yes.
Because they believe that individuals come together and form social contracts.
That's called the community of interest. It's something I read in Quigley's book, right? When people come together, and the community of interest of individuals is supposed to come together and form a social contract so that it benefits the whole. In other words, the individual interests coming together will actually benefit the whole, and supposed to be able to carve out a social contract that benefits everybody. That's a very 19th century thought.
So the focus is on the individual. The assumption underpinning liberalism is not that human beings are social animals from the get-go. That's the first point.
That's part of where the unalienable rights actually come from, as far as liberal thought.
Second point is that liberalism assumes that we cannot use our critical faculties. We cannot use reason to come up with truth about first principles. Think about issues like abortion, affirmative action. You cannot get universal agreement on those issues, right? And I'll talk about this more as we go along, but the roots of liberalism are traced back, in my opinion, to the religious wars in Britain between Catholics and Protestants. And the fact is, you cannot use your critical faculties to determine whether Catholicism is a superior religion to Protestantism, or vice versa, or whether atheism is superior to both of them, or Judaism or Islam is superior to Catholicism and Protestantism. Who knows, right? You just can't reach agreement. There are real limits to what we can do with our critical faculties. Okay, so these are the two bedrock assumptions. One, you focus on the individual, and number two, you accept the fact that you can't reach universal agreement. Now, central question, how should politics be arranged to deal with this potential for violence? And you say to yourself, what does he mean, potential for violence? The fact is that Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in huge numbers, not only in Britain, but all over Europe.
France, yeah.
People today Shias and Sunnis kill each other because they can't agree on whether Shiism or Sunniism is the correct interpretation of Islam. Or communists versus liberals.
Yep.
People can't agree on first principles.
Right.
And when they can't agree on first principles, if they feel really strongly about them, there is potential for violence.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have all these individuals running around who don't agree, they may agree in some cases, but don't universally agree, there's tremendous potential for violence. So liberalism is basically an ideology that's based on conflict. And the question is, how do you solve that conflict? There's a three-part solution, and this should be dear to all of your hearts. The first is you focus on individual rights. Remember the importance of the individual.
Right, right.
You know the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are natural rights. Those are inalienable rights.
Uh-huh.
This means that every person on the planet has a particular set of rights, sometimes defined as freedoms. This is to say, you, if you want to be a Protestant, have the right to practice that religion. And if I want to be a Catholic, I have the freedom, I have the right to be a Catholic. The name of the game is to recognize that everybody has these freedoms to choose.
Mm-hmm.
This makes perfect sense when you think about Catholics killing Protestants,
Right.
Or Jews killing Muslims, or whatever group you want. Atheists killing believers, communists killing whatever, right? The point is, you want to focus on the individual and let the individual choose for him or herself what kind of life they want to lead. You want to let them lead as much as possible their version of the good life. And very important, every person on the planet has that right. And let me get ahead of myself here. Just put this seed in your brain. If you focus on individualism and inalienable rights, you go almost automatically from an individualistic ideology to a universalistic ideology, right? Because again, you're focusing on the individual, you're saying every individual has a set of rights, every individual on the planet. That individualistic ideology becomes a universalistic ideology. But we're talking about the individual here. The second is you purvey the norm of tolerance. We talk about tolerance all the time. Universities are really big on tolerance. We're supposed to tolerate opinions that we don't like.
Yeah, that is true. Okay. Which conservatives don't normally do, and sometimes neither do progressives. But continuing.
You bring in speakers, or you allow speakers to come in who say things that you find reprehensible. Right? Tolerance really matters. But the fact is that tolerance only takes you so far, because you're dealing with people who sometimes are so committed to their beliefs. You know, somebody who believes that abortion is murder is willing to murder a doctor who practices abortion, right? So you need a state. That's the third element.
That's Hobbes, and that's the Leviathan. If you go back to Green Gorilla's video on Hobbes, he talks about the state, or the Leviathan, that settles these little petty disputes and settles protects support the rights, okay, the inalienable rights between individuals, so you can actually come together in some kind of harmony. And Hobbes said you needed the state, or the Leviathan, the overseer, the cop on the block, to actually come in and referee when people disagree with something, so you have some kind of harmony
Of the equation. You need a state that's effectively a night watchman, that makes sure that those people over there who want to live as Protestants don't attack those people who want to live as Catholics, or vice versa. This is the liberal solution. This is what America is all about. Individualism, we talk about it all the time. We talk about rights. Everybody has rights. My kids over the years have always reminded me, when I tell them that they have to do X, Y, and Z, that they have rights. And I cannot interfere with their rights. right? It's the way we're educated from the get-go. And of course, we're a remarkably tolerant people as societies go. Not completely, but that's of course why we have a state, right? You gotta have a police force, you gotta have a system of courts, right? So that's what liberalism is all about, right? Liberalism focuses on the individual, right? Pervades the norm of tolerance and accepts the fact that you need a night watchman state. Now, let's talk about nationalism. Different animal. Nationalism is based on the assumption that human beings are social animals. We are born and we are heavily socialized into tribes. We are not.
Yes, we are human beings from the get-go. Before we had these inalienable rights, before we got into liberalism, okay, there was tribalism or clanism because you had a smaller clan. And all the states and all the kind of stuff are outgrowths of this organic fact. I always tell so-called conservatives who are really classical liberals that believe in this rugged individualism that guess what? You're really not. You're really a social animal. Continuing.
Not born in the state of nature. We are not individuals born and left alone in the woods. We are born into groups. We are very tribal. So you see, in terms of starting assumptions or bedrock assumptions, what underpins nationalism, what underpins liberalism, very, very different. And individualism takes a back seat to group loyalty, right? Somebody around the world kills an American, ISIS kills an American, it's fundamentally different than killing a Saudi or killing a Brit, because you're killing one of us.
Mm-hmm.
The tribe, right? You're an American.
You're an American.
Americans look out for other Americans. We're social animals from the get-go. And aside from the family, the most important group, remember I said that you're born into and heavily socialized into particular groups. Putting aside the family, the most important group in today's world is the nation. I'll say more about that in a second. What's nationalism? Here's my simple definition. It's a set of political beliefs which holds that a nation, a body of individuals with characteristics that purportedly distinguish them from other groups should have their own state. Think of the word nation state. Nation state. Nation state embodies what nationalism.
In fact, the idea of a nation or a nation state is a very almost like a 19th century idea. It's a very liberal idea. Didn't really come about till the like the mid 18th century.
Is all about. It says the world is divided up into these tribes called nations, and each one of them wants its own state. If you think about the world today, just look at a map of the world today. It is completely covered with nation states. Nothing but nation states. If you went back to 1450 and you looked at a map of Europe, there isn't even a single state on that map. Over time, with the growth of the state and then the growth of the nation state, you move to a world that is filled with nothing but nation states. Look at the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Jews who believed in Zionism. What is Zionism all about? It's all about having your own Jewish state. Theodor Herzl, who was the father of Zionism, his most famous book is called The Jewish State, Jewish Nation State. What do the Palestinians want? Two-state solution? Palestinians want their own state. Palestinians are a nation, they want their own state. The planet is filled with nations, many of which have their own state, almost all of which want their own state. Nation state. Right? That's what nationalism is all about.
That's what usually causes civil wars. In fact, it really caused ours back in the mid 19th century.
Take it a step further. Nations place enormous importance on sovereignty or self-determination, which is why they want their own state. The Palestinians don't want the Israelis deciding what their politics should look like. Palestinians want their own state. Jews want their own state. Germans want their own state. Americans want their own state because they believe in sovereignty. You saw this with Donald Trump. Remember, Donald Trump ran in the campaign on a platform that he referred to as America First. Just think about that. America first. America, particular nation, take care of us first.
Donald Trump was effectively an isolationist, but that's another story for another day.
And he has made it very clear that he does not want anybody interfering in our sovereignty. And he was saying yesterday he doesn't think we should be interfering in the sovereignty of other countries. Right? That's recognition of the power of nationalism. Right? So nations want their own state. And then once you get nation states, they place enormous importance on sovereignty or self-determination. Who are these Russians to be interfering in our elections? The United States is a sovereign country. No country like Russia, or any other country for that matter, has the right to interfere in our elections. It's the basic argument here. That's what nationalism is really all about. Okay, so you get a feel for the difference between liberalism and nationalism. Liberalism focuses on the individual, and therefore, because it emphasizes individual rights, which everybody has a universalistic dimension. Nationalism is particularistic at the core. Right? Fundamentally different. Okay, so what's liberal hegemony? I've given you the definition of liberalism and the definition of nationalism that I've worked out. Let me talk a little bit about liberal hegemony. It's basically an attempt to remake the world in America's image. And it has three components. The first is spreading liberal democracy all over the globe. And the reason that I put 3 stars up there is it is the most important of the 3. Right? This is the idea that we want to turn every country into a liberal democracy. We want every country on the planet to have the same political system that we do here in the United States. Second goal is we want to integrate more and more countries into the open international economy. This is where we have an emphasis on free trade, lots of economic intercourse, right? Free capital flows, and so forth and so on. You know the whole story. And then third is we want to integrate more and more countries into international institutions, like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, NATO, think NATO expansion, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Obama administration was building and which President Trump cashiered. Okay, the liberal story places a great emphasis on institutions. It places a great emphasis on an open international economy, and most importantly on spreading democracy. Just to give you a feel for this, Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony. Right? And liberal hegemony, to be clear, was supported by both Republicans and Democrats. As I like to say, the Republicans especially, but the Democrats also like to make the argument that there's a big difference between the two parties on foreign policy. This is not a serious argument. This is Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Hardly any difference between the Republicans.
Yeah, everybody says that.
There's a real difference between Donald Trump and both of them. Remember, Donald Trump ran the table in the Republican primaries by criticizing the Republicans' performance on the foreign policy front for decades and criticizing the Democrats in the general election. Donald Trump said, I'm not interested in spreading liberal democracy across the globe. And in fact, he was quite comfortable making nice with dictators. Second, he was not interested in supporting an open international economy. In fact, he is showing today that he is willing to put tariffs on China, Canada, and our European allies. And as far as international institutions are concerned, he said NATO is obsolete. He was contemptuous of the World Trade Organization, contemptuous of the European Union, does not like the IMF, does not like the World Bank, does not like NAFTA, cashiered the TPP.
He does not like green eggs and ham, and he doesn't like Sam I Am.
That's Donald Trump. He ran against this. But Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, they embraced this after the Cold War.
Republican or Democrat, it didn't make a difference. But Donald Trump was an isolationist. And I think when he was actually a president, I said Donald Trump was isolationist. And actually, Donald Trump wanted to kill NATO. He did. He said he wanted to pull money from NATO. Donald Trump really wanted to pull out of Afghanistan, but his generals talked him into staying. And guess who got us back into NATO and got us back into Europe, which Donald Trump tried to get us out of? You guessed it. Anyway, continuing. But this is your bonus, right? This is a bonus about liberalism. And I actually wanted to get in this piece about Donald Trump and how the difference between Donald Trump and the rest of the liberals that we talk about, right? Whether they're Democrat or Republican, because people keep talking about Democrat or Republican. It depends on how you look at the world. You know, some things Donald Trump was right about. Some things Donald Trump was wrong about, depending on which way you look at things. Anyhow, because Eisenhower wanted out of NATO. Eisenhower wanted to kill NATO. And really, so did Kennedy. So it didn't matter about a Republican or Democrat when it comes to things like this. Okay. At the end of the day, they're all liberals. But continue. It's going to take another minute or so, and they're actually going to kind of close it out.
Ended. And by the way, it was the failure of this policy. It's the failure of American policy that helped put Donald Trump in the White House. For those of you who say to yourself, how could this man have ever been elected president of the United States? I'm telling you an important part of the story. Right? It's the failure of the foreign policy elites in this country to produce over the past 30 years. Okay. What are the benefits of liberal hegemony?
All right. That is, well, let's go ahead and play the benefits.
This is very important. In other words, why did we go down this road? In part is due to the fact that the foreign policy elites in the United States had a story to tell about how this was going to lead to all sorts of wonderful consequences. First of all, if you turn every country on the planet into a liberal democracy, you basically eliminate significant human rights violations. We don't need R2P or any more of these policies that are designed to run around the world protecting human rights, because human rights are no longer threatened, because the world is comprised of nothing but liberal democracies. Second, and maybe even more importantly, liberals tend to believe, and again, I'm using liberals to include Democrats and Republicans, they believe in what's called democratic peace theory. That is that liberal democracies don't fight each other. So if you can create a world of nothing but liberal democracies, they don't fight each other, peace breaks out, and problems like proliferation and terrorism are taken off the table. And it's just a world of peace, love, and dope. Can't get much better than that, right? And then finally, it makes the world safe for liberal democracy. As you all know, inside every liberal democracy, there are going to be elements who don't like liberal democracy. When I was a kid, this was the Communist Party in the United States. Well, if there's no Soviet Union out there that's a communist state that can interact with those communists in the United States, then you don't have to worry about those communists in the United States getting support from abroad. So what we do is we make the whole planet nothing but liberal democracies, and that really ameliorates the problems that any of these liberal democracies have on the home front, because there's no foreign power that can assist them. This is a Woodrow Wilson-like argument made by the likes of George Bush, right?
Okay.
So these are...
All right. I think that's enough. Yeah, but that gives you a pretty good overview about liberalism versus collectivism. Nationalism is nothing but collectivism. And sometimes the state steps in and overrides whatever you're saying. The state just did as far as abortion, which if you go by individual liberalism, right, guess what? Women are allowed to have an abortion as long as it's safe. What happens when the state needs babies and the nation needs babies as to keep itself afloat? Guess what they did? Nationalism or collectivism actually trumps what women think, or trumps the individual rights. Parents patriae, right? Okay. They force women to have babies and then stick men with the bill. That's the way they want it to work. And basically, if you don't want to pay up the bill according to the state, you're going to jail, taking away your individual rights. As he says, the state, nationalism, collectivism actually trumps the individual rights. The next video, we're actually going to go break down into the two classes of liberals, which is in his video, Liberalism for Dummies. where she really breaks it down into finer detail. But I just wanted to get this one out because this is a good introduction to liberalism as a fundamental tenet, exactly what it is, because you can actually go read Quigley and a few other books. It'll tell you exactly the same thing, because I hear all these conservatives talking about negative liberty. I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. State can't make me do this. And I'm an individual, blah, blah, blah. That's a liberal idea. Okay. The Klan, as it were, they had rules. They had Klan rules. Okay. Now, like you said, they had rules for the whole collective. Now, there was, because you're a group, and they had carve outs for individuals, right? Which is the opposite of the unalienable rights, where individuals come together in a community of interest and actually carve out a social contract. Different idea. But anyway, I am going to cut this one short. This is for informational purposes only. You can agree or disagree. All I can say is be respectful. And if you have a point, make them logical, not just pulling ideas out of your behind, okay? Because what you heard on YouTube. And hopefully, if you really have an argument about liberalism versus collectivism or nationalism, or however you want to frame it, the individual versus the collective, hey, pull up something, man. Pull up some ideas, pull up some sources, okay? Let's have a real conversation. But with that, I am going to cut this one short and bounce out of here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.